Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness, is what I would say if I were Erik Davis and this were his amazing podcast, which I have been listening to for many, many years, since before podcasting was a phenomenon like it is today. And in that regard, Erik is, as I find to be the rule rather than the exception, way ahead of the curve. Erik Davis has got to be one of the more interesting people I know, and I know a lot of very interesting people. He wrote the fantastic book Techgnosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information when he was in his 20s, an intellectual feat for which I will be envious for as long as I am identified with the conditioned pattern of neural activity that calls itself Michael, which luckily is itself not a linear thing. And I'm not constantly envious of Erik because I am more and more these days entertaining the liminal unknowing that Erik has made such a proud case for in his work. And beyond his masterful way with language, beyond the sweeping synthetic understanding and penetrating insights, I am grateful for Erik's work in my life because of the way that he has modeled for me and many other people this mature skeptic, this canny, critical, thoughtful, but still playful, engaged, curious, genuinely open, genuinely in a state of becoming kind of person. And it's this kind of person that we agree in the conversation you're about to hear is encouraged by the accelerating environment in which we find ourselves, that as the pace of our lives increases, as we are encountered on a daily basis by more and more unfamiliar novel things, as the literacies required to navigate these complexifying spaces proliferate, and even as hyper-specialized individuals working in unprecedentedly intelligent and capable groups, we will have lost the plot. It's easy to imagine a world in which your average person's much, much more like Erik Davis than they are today. And for me, I'm glad to think of a world such as this awaiting us. A world of good-natured, humorous detectives. Rigorous yet flexible cyber psychonauts. Limber and evolving minds. But before we get into that, I just want to thank everybody who has been supporting this show on Patreon, including the newest patron, Catherine Carr. You all are helping me make a very, very challenging transition from my old life as an independent artist to my new life as an independent artist and a whole lot of other things. The father of a child and living across the country from where I do now. You know, I've just taken this new job at the Santa Fe Institute, and being a part of an institution is a very strange and different experience for me. And this podcast is kind of helping me keep myself sane so I don't feel like my entire life is changing all at once. You are the thread of continuity. So thank you. And because of this thank you, I'm going to be posting a whole lot of stuff in Patreon this month, including new coloring book pages and special patrons-only episodes, plural, and some other things. If you would like in on those things, if you want the backstage pass to my creative evolution, then sign up at patreon.com/Michael Garfield. All of those mediated interactions that we can have when you review the show or whatever, those are great, and they help other people find this conversation. But there is something so much more delicious and juicy and alive between me and the 120-some folks that are supporting the show on Patreon right now. It's really cool. At any rate, thank you all for listening. And episode 99! I love Erik Davis, and I'm so glad I get to share this with you. Enjoy. Erik, it's been a long time, and I think I'm especially excited because I was on your podcast before I even realized I wanted to start my own. And so the entire time I've had Future Fossils, I've been looking to return the favor. And
I'm really happy to be here and have a conversation. Yeah,
it's wonderful. Great. So, first of all, you just finished a book.
I did. Yeah, I finished my book, High Weirdness. It's going to be out in the spring through MIT Press and Strange Tractor, and I'm very psyched about it. It's got a great cover. I'm really happy.
That's it does have a great cover. I was really impressed by that painting, which is like a UFO mushroom, if I recall.
What it was is that, so the book is about the weirdness of the 70s, but it's mostly focused on three characters, on Terence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, and Philip K. Dick. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at their most extreme experiences and just trying to read them, trying to understand them from a kind of theoretical point of view, but also telling the story and all the cultural elements that are going on in the historical context of them. But I had this problem where I don't have their names in the title. It's called High Weirdness, Drugs, Visions, and Esoterica in the 70s. And I didn't want to have them on the cover, like their faces or their names. But I was like, and so I woke up in the middle of the night. I was in a state of kind of, it was more like insomnia. I often wake up in the middle of the night. It's often not insomniac anymore. It's just like a space of reflection. And I kind of like, sometimes I get up and meditate in the middle of the night and go back to sleep and have wonderful dreams. But this was a little more worrying, and I was, oh my God, how am I going to deal with the film? And then I was sitting there, and it just kind of in that dreamy space, and then I realized that there were symbols associated with each person, and that they could all be combined in a very beautiful way. And so for the people who know, they'll recognize what all these things mean. That the eye in the triangle is like an Illuminati, Robert Anton Wilson thing. But the eye is actually an eye from, this is the most subtle thing, is from a Philip K. Dick's drawings of these eyes. He was really into the Vesica Pisces, right? So it's his eye, and then you got the UFO mushrooms, the Terence kind of surrounding it, like the way that the Naga surrounds the Buddha. And it all came like boom, 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 boom in my visual imagination. And then I knew this wonderful artist, Eric Roper, who does a lot of heavy metal album covers. He did Sleeps, Dope Smoker. I mean, he's a classic guy who's very influenced by 70s style. So I know him. I was like, dude, can you whip this up? And he's like, yeah, great. So he did the cover, and it's just awesome.
That is, it's something that I think came out of listening to you and Lawrence Caruana on your show. For me, was this articulation that visionary art is, in the same way that the Renaissance artists learned this, 2 and 3 point perspective and learned to train lines converging on the horizon. Visionary art may be best defined as the attempt to train symbols from different cultures towards a transcendent horizon of human experience. And so I think your book, the cover art bodes well for, as a performance of that understanding.
Exactly. So, and I also I've always enjoyed the esoteric wink. Like, one of the things I've always tried to do in my writing is to put little Easter eggs that people who are in the know get an extra, fun from. But if you don't know, it still works, because it's still this weird, like, if you don't know what those mean, you still see this weird thing, and you're like, there's something powerful and strange.
Robert Venosa said something about that same effect in an interview he did with Reality Sandwich years and years ago, where he said he felt that there was something subversive about the art because it would affect you even if you didn't understand it, like that. He could reach the most sort of conservative person and get in there and affect something in them, plant a seed.
Yeah, well, in many ways, that's the basic motivation of the book is to enact that subversion or even kind of an infection of the weird through a kind of theoretical apparatus where if you're invested in those kinds of discourses, you can't help but encounter certain conundrums, and it's like, okay, now you got it. Like, what are you going to do with it? It's there's not an answer, and you got to kind of deal with it because you can't just write it off as kookiness. I mean, it's kooky, but it's more than kooky. And so now here it is. Like, what are we going to do with it? That's it. So it's a very resonant kind of approach to these things.
So, this program at least pretends to be about time and history and finding our place in the great cycles. So I'm curious, what have you decided after all of the thought work of writing this book compelled you to decide that this particular story is so resonant and relevant and important for this moment? Why now?
Well, so that's sort of like a historical question, and then for me, it's really about the 70s and kind of feeling that in some ways we haven't really reckoned with that moment, especially in terms of the counterculture. When we think about the counterculture, we usually think about the 60s, and we don't quite follow it into the darker, weirder, much more relevant period of the 70s, because the 70s is kind of the time that our time begins. And if you look at the history, if you look at what happens with capitalism, with the growth of consumer credit, with the sort of influence of surveillance and paranoia is a very important part of the 70s. And also, it's the era when we first have terrorism as a kind of performance, with all the plane hijackings, and there's kind of a density and sort of historical dread that happens, particularly in the early 70s. That's sort of the historical background of these experiences, which in some ways aren't directly political, but they're taking place in this new, you can call it postmodern if you want, environment that really begins in the 70s with diversity and the multiplicity of perspectives and the way in which the New Age and the occult revival, which are really emerging full force in the 70s, kind of shape the new subjectivity that's associated with that particular historical time. So I'm really interested, I'm a very historical thinker. Like when I approach like an abstract philosophy or a unique, brilliant aesthetic experience or expression, to kind of understand the historical context. And that's the zone.
It's interesting that you, well, first of all, that you call it the zone, because I know our friends over at Weird Studies have done quite a bit to pick apart the zone as a space of weirdness and the suspension of the normal. And so have you, in your writings on festival culture as a liminal space, et cetera. And, your wife Jennifer's treatment of the liminal states of consciousness in, heading into and out of sleep. And but there's this interesting connection that you just drew between the emergence of terrorism and the global neoliberal capitalism and the rearing of the head of the weird. I'm reading this book, which is I think also out on MIT Press. The Age of Discovery was they talk about these major historical shifts as being a folding of the margins of the map into the center of the map. That in the emergence of global shipping and that kind of international commerce, that it was the map centered on the Fertile Crescent, and then suddenly London and Amsterdam, which were over in the corners, are the center of the new map. And there's something about high weirdness poking out now. It's sort of a reassertion of the marginalia as the actual dominant cultural significant thing. And I'm curious to hear you speak on why you think that is and where it's taking us, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways I didn't, the book is fairly long, and I didn't really have as much room as I thought I would to draw a lot of explicit connections to our current moment. But certainly, if you look at things, just the way that the occult, conspiracy theory, the sort of dark, dreamlike character of a lot of genre material is all much more present now. It's much more central. So, like the way that conspiracy theory has now become weaponized and a sort of form of live story coherence that itself is kind of deeply fictional, and that way that like fictions become operational as quasi-truths, as a way to organize this sort of social and media chaos that we're involved in. I think that's no accident. I don't think it's an accident that the occult is back in fashion and in art theory, that conspiracy theory is such a central kind of part of our attempt to understand how people are constructing consensus reality. The popularity of psychedelics and the kind of psychedelic renaissance, I think all of those things can be seen as almost an unconscious recognition that the sorts of mind states that are able to navigate, understand, resonate with, and to some extent, not resist, but understand, like where you actually are kind of in that zone consciously, that those skills are absolutely necessary in this point of kind of consensus reality meltdown. And they might not in the end help, but they seem to at least allow for a certain kind of navigational ability. And then, in my opinion, when it's still coupled with a certain kind of critical awareness that's centered in history and the actual historical conditions that we're in. So, in a way, I feel like I'm kind of helping to allow that space to open up more.
So, what would you point to as key literacies in the weird future that we're strolling into here?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, a part of it is the way that fictions become, operationalized, where fictions become alive enough that you have to deal with them in a different context. I mean, I'm thinking here of a somewhat trivial example, but one that I think resonated with a lot of people was like the Slender Man meme. Mm-hmm. So you get Slender Man as a kind of goofy meme that emerges in this collective rhizomatic network space that's designed to be creepy, to kind of intrude on the liminal consciousness as a kind of play. And then it becomes this sort of tulpa. It becomes this kind of thought form that then has a sort of quasi-reality, such that some crazy young person can sort of embody it or work within a framework where that's a reality that motivates them. And since it's a good example because it's on the fringe enough, and the fact that there's really only, all we know about is this one event where, these young girls sort of take it on as a reality, but we're able to see a kind of logic that's much more widespread and much more central. So such that, I mean, just to be topical for a moment, there's no way that anything like these pipe bombs cannot be seen as a false flag. So there, in a sense, we've gotten to a place where there's no information, let's say, that seems to shed negative light on right-wing America. There's no event that can happen in the news space that will not instantly be reframed as a hoax. So we're in this place where reality and the hoaxing are inextricable. How do you move through that? I don't know, but it helps to understand how fictions can become reality. That there's sort of an ontological density to these collective stories and collective images that you kind of have to take seriously. The way that if you're a psychedelic traveler, you have to have ways of dealing with the entities or beings or weird, even paranoid visions that can happen in the space of a psychedelic experience. It's not that those things are real with a capital R, but you have to deal with them. You have to engage them. You have to know how to respond. And that kind of sensibility, I think, is actually a good way to go into a future when fictions, stories, fantasies, propaganda are more and more lively because of the media condition that we're in.
I was another episode of your show. I forget the guy's name. It was an H.P. Lovecraft scholar, and the two of you were talking about, Lovecraft would have qualified as a genuine visionary. That he was having these visions, that they were appearing to him spontaneously, in the same way that they did to H.R. Giger or whatever, but that he assumed this distance from them, this atheistic sort of disregard, and it appears in his stories that his characters are, that the reader sort of remains and the author sort of remains at a distance from the horror in some way.
Yes.
And then I like to try and trace the historical arc through Robert Anton Wilson and Phil Dick as people who were preoccupied with their own participation in that weirdness, and and so that it's like, it seems like there is a staggering involvation, a deepening acceptance of the weird participation mystique. I don't know.
Though I think weird and participation mystique is a good way of looking at it. I mean, I do. One of the threads in the book is about Lovecraft and the way that each of the different figures all had a relationship with him in important ways, and we're playing with that sense of fictions that can and disturbance that introduces.
It seems like if you were to trace that even further, that it's a turn and face the strange kind of moment here, where we would sort of get over that anxious preoccupation with it that they had in the 70s, and it just becomes sort of mundane. Like the tables completely flip in some way.
Yeah, it's true. No, I mean, that's part of the feature of the popularity of, I think, of both the occult and psychedelics and all, is that there's a way in which, as they fold into more into the center, they become banal. And that part of our historical fate, if you will, is to be in a situation when, all the nightmares came today, but it's sort of like woven into this peculiar banality that is a real feature of neoliberal capital and the state of media, where everything becomes kind of routinized and referenced and clipped and quoted and smashed and ironized, and all of those processes are happening at the same time. Sometimes it seems to me that banal is actually a real interesting kind of magic, because it sort of allows you to navigate without the full disturbance hitting home, and yet we're actually dealing with those things. So it's kind of like we're you can also talk about it in terms of the monsters that technology produces, whether they're, and we're just at the beginning of the kind of DNA monsters. And I mean monster in the sense of something that's disturbing because it is new, it's novel, it's a juxtaposition of categories that are used to be separated. And so it doesn't necessarily mean a negative thing when I say it, but it's just that we have to, turn and face the strange, that kind of strangeness is going to multiply. But part of the ways that it's integrated is to make it kind of banal. So if you look at the rapid acceptance, at least in some zones of the culture, of people who are trans. And it's like when you first encounter that idea, most individuals, whatever, they meet people or they discover it when they're young or whatever it is, at least historically, I don't know if this is true anymore for people who are young now, but it's like, whoa, that's kind of weird. That's kind of different. That's like a twist on these settled categories. But in order to really embrace and accept and play with the consequences of that kind of gender fluidity, you have to sort of accept that it's just normal, just part of everyday life. It's like, oh yeah, they're trans, whatever, cool, and that's really healthy, So there's a way in which we're called upon to analyze our resistances to, a whole variety of shifts, mutations, couplings, and that unless we want to go reactionary and hold on to certain ideas we have about how humans should be or how the world should be, that we're in a situation of a strange kind of embrace with the other.
So do you suppose that this kind of boundary confusion is on just this constant ratchet into deeper and deeper boundary confusion, or do you see this as a sort of musical chairs in between the ages, like an interregnum? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Sometimes I feel like, and I still haven't figured out exactly the best way to explain this feeling, but that one of the capacities of human beings, like human beings are these strange animals because they're open. They're open to novelty. And once they get novelty going in some kind of social context, then the rule set changes to a certain degree, not entirely. But so there's this open process. But along with that plunge into novelty, we also carry with us a kind of banality, a kind of like everydayness, a kind of like ordinary, sort of anxious, sort of irritated, sort of desiring, sort of frustrated, kind of very human environment, and that we bring that with us. So sometimes I think that if somebody from the 19th century was sort of, 1850, let's say, was translated to our zone, appeared in this, we would look much more weird than we feel. We'd look like we were deeply embedded in some very strange technological mutation that's like crazy and not normal and really, but for us, yes, we can notice that everybody has these devices. The sense of time and space is changing. The boundaries between physical reality and virtual reality are, opening up and becoming porous. But there's also a sense like we just have our days. It's kind of ordinary. It's kind of lame. And so part of me thinks that even as things get really weird on one level, until there's a massive shift, if such a thing happens, or a massive collapse, that will maintain a certain sense of like the ordinary, which in a way is a gift to be able to still have that kind of connection. So I'm not sure about how that balance is going to, sometimes it feels like we're just a few ticks away from almost a kind of mass psychosis. And at the same time, it's sort of business as usual on this really weird level. And I don't know whether we kind of carry that with us as human beings. And so as long as the humans around, there's always this space where it's just kind of goofy humans trying to make do and whatever in the midst of all of these transformations. That reminds me of, there's a scene about halfway through Charles Stross's novel Accelerando, where the characters that we've been following have been translated into data and have been uploaded into a computer the size of a grain of rice and are inhabiting a virtual reality as they fly to the nearest star in a spacecraft the size of a soda can. And they're having a debate inside this simulation about whether or not the singularity has happened yet or not. And they're all like in they're like Renaissance fair mods, one of them's dressed up as a velociraptor, and they're all sitting there like, the singularity, no, that's just nonsense. It's never going to happen. We're never going to get there. It's like a Zeno's paradox thing.
Yeah.
It was, no, it totally happened 20 years ago. It's like,
well, that's the thing is like, if it already, it's like if to think mythically, if the internet could be a kind of mind, could be a kind of intelligence or some sort of networked, even consciousness, that could already be the case, and we're just not aware of it. So it's in a way, I do distrust the kind of tendency towards the apocalyptic, the singularity, the total breakdown, all of those sort of fantasies of radical change. That has happened over and over and over and over again in history, that people had that kind of anticipation. And when you look backwards in the rearview mirror, you're like, yeah, I mean, that's an allegory of historical changes that are radical in perspective, but the actual thread of human existence within that zone, except for crazy prophets, is largely still kind of ordinary. So I can totally see something like that, where we're in that, we are uploaded and we're playing a game, and we could spend the rest of our time there, but we still bring along a certain kind of recognizable human, crankiness and love and eros, and it's very familiar in a way, and we kind of carry that with us, it's both like a virus and like a kind of charming, continuity in human behavior and human personality. I mean, that's kind of my gut feeling on it. I could be wrong, but even though we're in a very postmodern environment, to use a kind of outdated term now, there still is a lot that's recognizably human.
It's funny because I think you and I would agree on it. The weird is almost like a horizon of human experience, and it moves with us as our coordinates shift.
Absolutely.
Then it sort of keeps a continuous sort of stable distance, and that it marks almost more just like a perimeter between the known and the unknown. And in that way, the weird is frankly kind of like a friend. It's not something that ever truly just devours us or... Yeah. It's something to kind of lean into, and then also talk about climate change and all that. There's other people have referred to global warming as global weirding, and I remember very distinctly when my father's an oceanographer, and increasingly oceanography is a kind of climate science. And he was talking about, the thing about warming is that it doesn't just get warm. This is, years and, 15 years ago. It's that when things become warmer, it's not just that they heat up, it's they become more turbulent. And then when you start to follow what turbulence is, then you begin to get a better sense of like the fluctuations and the unexpected positive feedback loops. And it's all much more strange than just getting hotter or just getting wetter or just having rising sea levels. It's that suddenly we're in a zone where the weather itself is weird. It's no longer normal. Like I'm not familiar now with this pattern that's happening where I actually live. And so one of the ways that horizon of weirdness appears in our life now is in this very basic sense of the weather, and the weather being, not just an object out there, but a space that we're always within. I mean, where there's always, no matter where we are in our lives, no matter what we're doing, no matter we're doing something on the computer, we're doing something in a room somewhere in a city, we're out hiking, we're growing food, it doesn't matter. The weather is always with you. It's always the ambiance. It's always the sense of the kind of environmental surround, the tonality of the spaces that we're in. And that on a literal physical planetary level, mutant, unexpected. It's potentially anomalous, and the anomaly is another way of thinking about the weird in a more concrete way, because the idea of anomaly, is important in science. It's an important way to mark things that don't fit the paradigm without saying they're supernatural or mystical or don't have a cause. But it does mark things as being outside of a given paradigm or a given framework of understanding. And I feel like our textured experience of the everyday anomaly, and that's. Yeah. I was just you cut out for a second, but I thought feel like we still caught you there. But you said the textured experience of the everyday has become
that we're just in greater proximity to anomaly, and that itself creates that sense of weirdness where we're not really entirely sure about the the environment that is around us. There's a kind of something is let loose, something is unknown, something. So we're in some ways more able to commune with the fundamental mystery of things because the texture of every day, the nature of consensus reality as it's mediated through our devices and the internet is warbling.
Yeah, that there's this this thing about the anomaly. In talking about the increasing rapidity or frequency of anomalous events, I think about Arthur C. Clarke's, I forget, first or second law, where he says if an elderly distinguished scientist tells you that something is impossible, he's probably wrong. And that there is, I feel like, a trend into this sort of childlike beginner's mind, the neuroplasticity required to accommodate and adapt to all of this turbulence is becoming, highly selected for, and that it's warping the human psychology into this kind of like juvenile state, a state like where they talk about, children have very low signal to noise ratios. They're kind of tripping all the time. And that's how you're able to learn as fast as you do as a child. But to, as we're learning to reopen the critical learning window to make it possible for the brain to learn as much as a child's brain does, then there's only so much real estate in there, and we have to give up some of what we were in order to accommodate the new. And so it's like it feels as though in the figure ground collapse that you're talking about here, where Tim Morton has talked about this also, right? About every sort of local weather event being an indicator of global climate change, and so you never really, you can't keep the background out of the foreground, and when that happens, that it's like a state change in human psychology, and we cease to be these sort of static points, or it becomes, I don't know, maybe moves from like a fluid to a gas or something. Yeah, there is a kind of gas, and I love the way that you framed the juvenile aspect of things, because I think it's really true that if you look at culture, and I must kind of say most of what we're talking about applies to one part of our current social reality, at least here in America. And of course, there's an other part of the contemporary social reality that's resisting these things, that sees, in some ways, and it's, complicated, and we don't have to talk about the right wing and all that kind of shit, because that's a different conversation. But in some ways, reactionary positions or the attractions of fascism have to do with providing a ground in the midst of and I think it's really important for people who are on the sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of postmodern, plastic, even post-human kind of approach, where we recognize these changes are underway. A lot of them are going to be very difficult. That we might be able to guide them to some degree, but a lot of what's happening is sort of already written into the story. We're open for it. We're hoping that we can keep our values alive as we move into this space. But there's a big chunk of people who are just like, no. And so even as they're participating with equal ferocity in the very environment of this mutation, they're insisting or reproducing a fiction or a fantasy or a story or a narrative or a mythology of clear boundaries, of no, men and women are defined by their birth gender, by their genitals, or the borders between countries and the line between illegal people and legal people, and all of the ways that the right fetishizes boundaries, definitions, traditional categories, sources of value from the Bible or whatever. And that's all complicated by what's happening with capitalism. But in terms of the values and the reasons that people get so drawn into these stories, part of it has to do is that they provide a sense of a ground or a knowing who you are in the midst of a situation where many of us who aren't attracted to those stories recognize that not knowing who we really are is
part of the game. And in fact, it's one of the great opportunities of our moment. I mean, even if we are plunging into a dystopia, along the way, here we are, here's our historical fate. There's a tremendous opportunity to dig down and understand who we are in the very attempt to navigate and not lose yourself and not become so plastic that you're a puppet. What does it mean to be, in control? There's Catherine Malibu, who's a neuroscientist, but who's very influenced by, or a neurologist. I'm not exactly sure what her science background is, but she's more or less a neuroscientist, but also studied with Derrida and has this kind of theoretical approach. She makes a distinction between plasticity and flexibility. It's a really interesting idea because she says, look, contemporary capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, wants plasticity. It wants workers who are able to learn, to constantly change, to be always ready, to be on call, to not have a fixed work day, all of the ways in which, the gig economy and the sort of constant novelty of technology demand a kind of flexibility. She makes a distinction between that kind of flexibility, which she sees as problematic, to plasticity. And plasticity, she frames it as, yes, it's the ability to change or to modulate in relationship to changing conditions, but we're still in control to some degree. That plasticity is a kind of, there's still an element of like will or shaping or awakeness. It's not a pure flexibility. I don't know if we can maintain this distinction, but it's a really interesting one as we think about it, because I think it's always important to recognize that the kind of shift or psychological mutation that we're talking about is not the same thing exactly, although it's related to the flexibility that neoliberal capitalism demands.
Yeah, because, there is this trend in science fiction as a critique of, various philosophical positions, and I like, you can look at Jaron Lanier's critique of cybertotalism, one half of Manifesto, or you can look at Charles Stross again in Glass House, where he's talking about how by uploading ourselves, and he's not the only one that's done this, dozens of authors have addressed this, but by uploading ourselves into a digital platform, we become more and more transparent to these kinds of what we're calling here capitalist manipulations, that, wars are no longer fought by killing people who can constantly respawn from a digital backup. They're fought by corrupting the backup and hacking people. And we look forward to this age beyond advertisements, but we're already living in an age where, content marketing, or whatever the hell you want to call it, eventually neuromarketing and so on, is that you never even see the ad. You just want the thing, and like, that's not, that is very, very distinct from, the other form of adaptation, which is to retain a sort of, at least some sort of determination over what causal vectors you allow to shape your landscape of desire, if that makes any sense. That sense of choosing who has control over you.
I think it's a very good way of thinking about it, and it also demands that we, we recognize that we have sort of, how to say this, within our own processing as psychological, physical beings who can engage with practices that transform ourselves. The German philosopher Sloterdijk talks about this as anthropotechnics. And his basic idea is that what humans are, they're kind of like practicing creatures. They can take on practices that in turn transform the very subjectivity of those who are practicing. And you can see this most obviously in, sports or acrobats or whatever, people who rigorously discipline themselves in order to kind of shift the very nature of their, or at least the capacity or shape of their subjectivity. The same thing happens with meditators or, people who follow ascetic paths. And he looks at religions. He says, religions aren't really, we misrecognize religions. We think they're about beliefs. We think they're about symbol systems. But really what they are is kind of a name for the practices that people engage in their self-transformation. And of course, those happen outside of religion as well. So becoming aware of the way in which we're practicing creatures, and that by using the phones the way we do, or by surfing the internet the way we do, or by making decisions about where we buy, all of those things are in a way self-engendering practices. But there's a whole, grab bag of practices that exist, not strictly within that environment, things that people have been able to do for a very long time, like meditation. So that gets back to the point I was saying earlier, where I think that the mainstream attraction towards meditation, towards psychedelics, towards a certain kind of occult, esoteric, weird, new age kind of thing is all a way to sort of hone in on those practices that in some sense can keep us awake, or keep us to some degree in control of our own mutation in relation to things that we can't control at all.
Yeah, that's, I think Richard Doyle talks about this in Darwin's Pharmacy, and I was just also tweeting now for the Santa Fe Institute, having picked up that social media gig with them, and one of their professors just published a textbook on an intro to complexity science, where they basically say that the underlying pattern of all of these different complex systems, the general theory of complex systems, is in the way that they behave as co-evolving algorithms. And that there's this sense in which, by sort of accepting the embrace of the machine and the cybernetic epistemology of, Stanford Research Institute, and this what Yuval Harari calls the new religion of Silicon Valley, that the self is just a bunch of programs and can be reprogrammed. But that actually has like a very, estimable history in other way headier and weirder people like John Lilly. And, you spent a lot of your time talking about that, and about sort of the sort of brighter transcendent opportunities of regarding the self as software.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I mean, personally, I feel like I can do that. Maybe it's my temperament. Maybe it's I'm not really sure why, but I feel like that practice for me is also always balanced with a relationship with deep history. I mean, we started out talking about time, talking about the 70s, talking about the currents of where things come from. So even as I try to open to this algorithmic reality, this sort of cybernetic process, positive feedback loops that have, characterized society in some extent for a long time, but certainly in the post-war era. I mean, that's sort of how I look at the 20th century. Is the most important thing that happens in the 20th century is cybernetics, both the concept and the operationalism of creating communication feedback loops that begin to generate their own processes. And you can look at the financial system that way. You can look at modern media that way. You look at the way computers work, the way algorithms work, the way they run off of loops and recursive functions, that there's this kind of thing that's let loose at the end of World War II, when cybernetics kind of hits the stage and we go into the 1950s, and a lot of that stuff begins to shape the institutions that organize the post-war game, which in some sense we're coming to the end of, or is dissolving or fragmenting or unraveling or intensifying or something like that. That to the degree that I'm riding that, which also means having a systemic look at the human being, of not being romantic about who we are and But at the same time, I find that I'm all in ever deeper relationship with, let's say, ancient Greek philosophy or Buddhism or indigenous wisdom and the actual anthropology of indigenous societies. Not so much the romantic sense that they're at one with nature and all that, which I don't really believe, but the ways in which their life worlds and their practices are incredibly sophisticated and well tuned to the nature that we are still to some degree beholden to. And that's one of the weird things about our moment when we talk. So on the one hand, we have this technological thing. On the other hand, we have this climate change thing. And the climate change thing is always reminding us that we are animals on a planet on this fragile biosphere, which is this like thin film of amazement on a, meaningless rock and a meaningless void. And, that's a very weird place to be. So we're kind of like pulled in multiple directions. And so as the farther I go into sort of a cybernetic model, I am also aware that, at least for me, it needs to be ground out in a deepening relationship with animals, with weather, with food, with plants, with plant wisdom, and definitely with those peoples in whatever traces and whatever mutations we can encounter them now. But those groups, those societies that had a very different relationship that's not really mediated by the machine. So to me, that kind of tension, which is very much in someone like Terence McKenna, who's on the one hand a futurist and a apocalyptic McLuhan, technological thinker, and he always was. At the same time, there's this relationship to the plants or to a very material sense of being a human being. So for me, it kind of needs to be in balance. I mean, balance, I don't know if there's a right word, but in tension. Whereas some people seem very comfortable to just fully like let loose, cut the ties, let's accelerationism, or let's just plunge on forward. And I understand why some people do that, but when I'm around those people, I often feel a kind of there's a kind of loss there, and that may again just be a kind of temperamental or generational sensibility that doesn't really necessarily apply to the condition, but I think it does, and I think that's again why we see these things folding into the mainstream, however corny, however misunderstood, however problematically appropriated. There's a reason that we're looking at these various traditional or ancient or liminal consciousness kinds of experiences, because they provide a ballast or another framework to understand or navigate this algorithmic environment that we're plunging into.
Well, insofar as this is an apocalypse, you would think that an apocalypse as an unveiling would reveal something you didn't already know. And I feel like that's sort of one of the weird blind spots that you're talking about in among those who, the accelerationist is a good word for it, because I feel like I'm participating in a quickening, and it's funny, like what's in a name, and how looking at the same thing from like very similar synonyms reveals such different horizons and vistas here. It's like there's something about the quickening and its relationship to, the enlivening of something, like mud becoming, like in Prometheus, the black goo, it like just turns stuff into life, and that as we reach this, the belt buckle on the other side of what we thought of as reality, where evolution itself has become a technology. And really, you can point a century back to Thomas Huxley, and he's saying this. He's saying, in the years immediately after the publication of The Origin of Species, about the massive shift required of us to take any kind of agency with respect to evolution as a process. And when that happens, of course you would expect that suddenly things are going to start talking to you that you didn't expect to have a voice. I feel like, with just any amount of consideration, the apocalypse is not just, plug me back into the umbilicus, serve me entertainment and allow me to be my little pocket demigod. Although obviously there's like more room for that in a weirded future than there is in the present. Also, it would seem as though, you're talking about the cultural retrieval of these things like the acceptance of non-human intelligence, and that there is something in the cyberpunk, William Gibson cyber dolphin thing, and there's something in the Terence McKenna, mushroom agency over the human mind thing, and there's something in the scientific acknowledgement of the so-called wood wide web, all of these underground relationships, and this, the way that the forest sort of operates as a single what SFI would call a liquid brain, like an anthill, that the liquid brain as an entity, as an acknowledged entity, is sort of that apocalypse. And so it's not, in a way, like, I don't know if I see the same tension, between that kind of archaic revival, that kind of reclamation of these things and reevaluation of them.
The way that what's bringing this up for me is the way in which animism, whatever we mean exactly by animism, is of central importance to this whole conversation. Because when we think about, as you're saying, is that one of the features of our moment is the recognition that intelligence and agency lies everywhere, and certainly in many realms outside the human. And again, it's an interesting parallel that at the moment when we're really considering on a culture-wide basis artificial intelligence, when people are interacting with algorithmic dolls and strange forms of avatars that are running on AI that we're interacting with, or where we shift to having algorithms be our investment advisors rather than people, that we're not going to be directly interfacing with an algorithm. We're going to be interfacing with some kind of weird avatar that's created somewhere that has a sense of personality. And as those personalities get better and better, we're in the situation where whether or not we believe they are actually intelligent or actually entities, our practice is that we're going to be interacting with these things in the digital realm. And at the same time, again, I feel like the return of sort of indigenous models, the sense of our understanding of the way in which we are profoundly embedded in all of these non-human relationships with non-humans, and whether we're talking environmental or all of the critters in our gut, the way that who am I am a simian spew mixed with this incredible microbiome, bacterial festival that's like constantly seething and shifting and affecting my moods, and like that already is this profound relationship with not just the other, but the multiplicity of the other, meaning both that the other is not just one entity, like talking to a deer spirit, but it's like talking to a hive or talking to a swarm. And that kind of relationality, you need to be developing that in order to understand what's going on, even from a like practical kind of normal, like a secular materialist, rational kind of point of view. But spiritually, there's a much deeper sense in that we're called upon to recognize the multiplicity of others, and it makes sense that there, that the rivers have a certain claim, and so you get into that idea, like in Bruno Latour, where there's this kind of vision of it's a very hopeful vision of a sort of democracy, if you will, of humans and non-humans, because the agency is distributed all over the place. So the fact that that's happening kind of both in the environmental consciousness, and where the wood wide web is even just a thinkable concept that you read about in the mainstream media, that's something that people wrestle with. What a weird idea. I mean, 30 years ago, that's not happening. So we're multiple dimensions, but there's a shared quality to it that makes that model of the archaic revival still, I think, really valid, at least as an allegory.
To take it a layer deeper, even, it seems as though this is almost a kind of a biblical thing, that they talk about in the end times, everybody being brought back, and sort of, that on Judgment Day, you've got, everyone, it just sort of comes back up out of the ground, and we're all hanging out in simultaneity. And there's a whiff of that in the Jurassic Park conversation. And in like the de-extinction of the passenger pigeon, and the Russians want to de-extinct the mammoth, and a collapse, and a historicity, sort of as the asymptote that we're approaching is. I talk about this all the time. I know that you've brought it up a lot. You've talked with Doug Rushkoff about present shock. Everything happening at once, and so I don't know. I feel as I don't want to keep you here all night, but I would love to hear you speak to what you think is going to happen to our experience of time in this space? So like what do you see happening, and does it even make sense to, obviously we're moving into a plurality, a sort of a greater diversity of temporal experiences, but like what trends, if any, and like in what directions?
Well, it's a good question. I don't feel like I have a very coherent answer for it, but I think you're, certainly right to point towards a weird, all histories are present kind of mode, which in some sense is already a part of that broader postmodern culture where you can sample and bring forward parts of the past, et cetera, et cetera. And, I remember Kevin Kelly once talking to me about the fact that like if you look at the whole history of like human craft, right? Like from the get-go, from the Neolithic, or even before, from the Paleolithic, all of the things that people have done with objects to make things happen, to cook, to produce artifacts, to manipulate the environment, that all of them are currently being done somewhere by some weird freak, wonderful experimenter, like all the people who do primitive practices, who go back to archaic ways of engaging the world, or doing metallurgy, or doing food. Like someone is practicing everything because they're kind of obsessed with that historical resonance. So it does sort of feel like as we go forward, we're echoing more and more all of these elements from earlier periods in history. And at the same time, I think our consciousness, at least, I mean, I'm not sure, I can't generalize, but in my case, I'm also more and more drawn to a kind of openness of awareness that has no real object other than its kind of ability to settle into the presence of the moment. And it's both deeply time marked, and there's a strange kind of timelessness about it too, a kind of openness. I think that negative capability that allows us to be in the space of contradictions and to hold them on a kind of meta level, that there's a register of that kind of frame, or that kind of model, it's not quite the right word, attitude in our sense of time. And again, I kind of think about these things in terms of almost homeopathic doses. Like we need to take little bits of different kinds of time in order to be able to navigate and not become completely overwhelmed, not to become someone who's driven in a purely reactive way by all of the inputs that are coming in, or who are dominated by fear, or dominated by particular stories about what's going to happen in a way that creates enemies, and all of the things that we're seeing right now. Another way around that is to become much more familiar on an individual, personal level with these different modalities of time that are available, particularly through meditation, and at least in my experience. So it's not that I think this is going to become something that we see everywhere in the world, but it does feel to me like more and more people are recognizing that kind of time that is able to just rest in presence without things happening, even though things still happen, something like that. That ability to suspend identification with some agent that's in history or producing something in time, that other modality or overtone becomes not just a space of reconnection or depth or disconnection from the craziness out there, but it becomes almost a survival tactic, almost a way of reacquainting us with different modalities of our own encounter with the world, as a way of kind of moving through this very confusing situation, quickening, apocalypse, whatever you want to call it, and all those terms do mean different things. But I think it's here's what I mean. The question of time becomes also a question of our own subjectivity, and that we, through anthropotechnics, have some degree not of control exactly, but of being able to set in motion, to plant seeds of processes that will allow subjective or consciousness kinds of events, openings, reframings, modalities that give us some of that plasticity rather than the simple flexibility, to refer to the earlier part of the conversation, that allow us to get our hands on some of that plasticity in a way that, again, keeps us awake.
It reminds me of, again, to resort to a physics metaphor, like the boundary layer, the lubrication allows things to flow past without too much friction.
Oh yeah. I think there's some of that, and that's a danger too. It's always I always take Zizek's critique of Buddhism and meditation to heart. His basic idea is that Buddhism is and by Buddhism, he means, he doesn't really understand Buddhism very well, but when he says Buddhism, he means kind of popular American, sort of superficial New Age mind meditation, mindfulness, things like that. And he says, look, this is the perfect religion of neoliberal capital. Why? Because it allows you to sort of create a buffer that absorbs or enables you to deal with the constant shock of the present tense changes. And so he sees that as a way of kind of numbing in relationship to the conflicts that might otherwise motivate, radical social change, or et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Maybe, and I think it's really important to always keep that in mind. Because that's also partly true, that process you're talking about, where you create a kind of smoothness that enables a little bit less friction to happen, also just enables us to be better workers, be better cogs, to design our technologies better that then go out and become parts of a military surveillance apparatus, all the things that people do in Silicon Valley, et cetera, that it's definitely not a panacea. It's definitely not something that intrinsically wakes us up. There always have to be values, intentions, and directions that are more than just these techniques of buffering or creating a kind of sense of space or a sense of openness around our reactivity. But at the same time, I think it's kind of bullshit that it's better to just stay on the level of reactivity, or it's just better to stay on the level of like tremendous social conflicts or psychological tension that has no other way of working. So I think it is a two-edged sword, that kind of consciousness work as a way of maintaining or establishing some kind of balance in the midst of the chaos we're in. But I also think it's a tool. That's not even the right way. It's a way of opening up our very capacity to understand those encounters with the other, those encounters with the monster or with the multiplicity or with the novelty, and that that's not just numbing. It's also leaning in. It's also extending and having a kind of comfort, even as we confront the weird.
Maybe the difference is in the attitude of flowing through as opposed to flowing over, or in addition to flowing over. Anyway, Erik, so I love to end these by inviting people to have a conversation with that unborn future audience, which I think if our speculations are close to the mark, there are people out there in the simultaneous future that are reenacting this conversation. So what advice would you give them in their...
That is a really trippy concept. I'm wrapping my head around that a little bit. That's such a funny one, because anything that you might bring forward is conceivably something that they can already simulate or already reconstruct. I read the classics. It's like it's not too late for Stoicism, early Buddhism. There's something in some of these basic, not basic, but just foundational moves of the human mind that continue to be worth engaging, even in the simultaneous simulacral future.
That's awesome, Erik. Thanks for being on the show.
All right, man. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Future Fossils is part of the MindPod network, along with shows like The Astral Hustle, Third Eye Drops, etc. Excellent. Go check them out. Next week's episode is 100, and it is with an authentic, real-life superhero, my friend, the Tea Fairy, and it might be the wildest conversation that has ever been on this show. So, thanks for listening. Subscribe if you have not already, and may your now be wide enough to drive a truck through.